On June 21st, 1923, in the blistering sun, Marcus Garvey's fate was thought to be sealed. Outside of a courthouse, admirers and onlookers swelled the judicial ivory tower, kneeling as Garvey, the emperor, was unmoved by the men and women alike kissing his hand as he glided past them toward his fate. A woman with an infant in hand fell to her knees in the Atlanta sun and wailed on the concrete, "Dear God, Jesus died on the cross for the same thing they're punishing Mr. Garvey for. Sweet Jesus, protect him." Garvey's experience points us to the reality of the omnipresence of anti-Blackness and the ever-looming threat of the American justice system. To the Black diaspora, they bore witness to the social death of their leader. And this social death was essentially tattooed into the subconscious of Americans through Garvey's jailing, right? And eventual deportation, nudging the Africans in the diaspora to essentially collectively forget about Marcus Garvey throughout much of the early 20th century in the United States. Now, fast forward to the present day, and Jamaica's first national hero, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, was pardoned on January 19th, 2025 by outgoing President Joseph Robinette Biden. And to be honest, I wasn't sure that this was going to happen, especially at just the late hour. This literally happened, the day before Donald Trump's inauguration. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm definitely excited, along with many Jamaicans and Africans and Black Americans and so many other people that just admire Garvey. I mean, we can see Garvey's legacy, for example, in the Black Star that's at the center of, the Ghanaian flag. And just even some of the names of different streets here in New York City. If you are someone who is familiar with the Bronx and you go to the intersection of Gun Hill and White Plains Road, Marcus Garvey's name is adorns the street corners, along with other street corners in Harlem and in Brooklyn. So many of us are excited about Marcus Garvey's pardoning. However, one thing that I feel like legal scholars particularly and scholars in Jamaica and academics would like for us to kind of acknowledge is that a pardon and an exoneration are two completely different things. With a pardon, right? A pardon essentially kind of basically acknowledges or basically implies that Garvey is still guilty for what he did. There's an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but still giving him the grace to kind of move on with his life, right? So the criminal record will continue to remain on the books, versus an exoneration that kind of wipes, the slate completely clean. So the pardon is absolutely symbolic, and it definitely speaks to the many political actors across various spaces that help to make this possible. Hear me out. And before you do that, I'm going to invite you to comment, and subscribe, so you can be my friend and I could be your friend. Please. Thank you. On December 20th, 2024, 21 members of Congress signed a petition to exonerate Marcus Garvey's 1923 mail fraud conviction. The members of Congress included in this petition were Yvette D. Clarke, who is actually a part of the Jamaican diaspora, Barbara Lee, Lisa Blunt Rochester, Frederica S. Wilson, Rashida Tlaib, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Henry C. Hank Johnson Jr., Gwen S. Moore, Erica Lee Carter, Delia C. Ramirez, Robin L. Kelly, Gregory W. Meeks, Danny K. Davis, Dwight Evans, Nikema Williams, Al Green, Jennifer L. McLean, Nadia M. Velasquez, Emmanuel Clever II, Andre Carson, and Summer Lee. So here is why, first of all, these members of Congress, including the many former Black Star Line members and the wider Black diaspora, did in fact believe that this conviction was unjust. So in Jailing a Rainbow, the case of Marcus Garvey, legal scholar Justin Hanford lays out a few reasons why Garvey's conviction should be overturned. In May 1923 was when Marcus Garvey's trial started. Marcus Garvey was essentially found guilty for one count of using the mail to defraud the public. The one count of mail fraud also came with a fine of $1,000. In 2024 or 2025, this would equate to about $18,600. So one of the first glaring red flags with this particular case was the fact that Judge Julian Mack was the presiding judge over Garvey's case and had a series of conflicts of interest that would have influenced his perception of Marcus Garvey and the case at large. So Judge Mack was actually a second generation Jewish American lawyer who was born in 1866 in San Francisco, California. So Judge Mack's family migrated from what is now present-day Germany. We're going to circle back to why Judge Mack's heritage is important in terms of his particular outlook on Marcus Garvey and this particular case in a minute. So Hansford argues that Judge Mack obviously was not someone who was a neutral judge in this particular case and was in cahoots or pretty cool with someone who you might know, W.B. Du Bois. And for those of us that are familiar with Black history and particularly Black American history or whatever, we understand that Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois were not cool with each other. They had the most epic beef of the 20th century. And we can hear some of just Marcus Garvey's thoughts about the NAACP here. So he says, between the Ku Klux Klan and the Moorfield Story National Association for the Advancement of Colored People group, give me the Klan for their honesty and purpose towards the Negro. They are better friends to my race for telling us what they are and what they mean, thereby giving us a chance to stir for ourselves than all the hypocrites put together with their false gods and religions notwithstanding. So if you didn't already understand that Marcus Garvey did not care for the NAACP, trust me. And if you would like me to do a video on the beef between Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, I'm happy to do so. Let me know in the comment section. So back to Judge Mack. So we know that ideologically, W.B. Du Bois and Garvey were basically on radical ends of the spectrum in terms of thinking about what Black liberation actually looks like for Black people. Now, on the end of the spectrum where Du Bois kind of sat, the NAACP, for the most part, while it was for Black liberation, was also one that kind of toed the line or kind of embraced radical egalitarianism, which essentially embraced the fact that if Black liberation was going to happen, it was going to happen through a multicultural sort of movement. And we see this later on as we get into the mid 20th century with MLK and so on and so forth. So anyways, with Garvey on the other end of the spectrum, Garvey was someone who was more of a nationalist, and so that kind of sits as firmly in his particular idea of race first, meaning any sort of progress or any sort of movement that we're making, we are thinking about Black people first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and last. Black people are at the center of his imagination, and none of his efforts are have anything to do with any other race, because at the time we're thinking about like actual nationalism, and we'll get into a bit more of Garvey's nationalist ideas in a bit. So Garvey essentially believed that his approach to, race first was the most appropriate approach, because white supremacy globally, its response to the Black body at that particular time was so harmful and so oppressive that the only way for him that felt like progress was going to be made is if Black people became more insular. So, and especially thinking about where Marcus Garvey's body had kind of was and where he moved, Marcus Garvey was someone who was Jamaican and like was a survivor of British colonialism, for example. He was someone who also lived in the United States. And while Jim Crow wasn't necessarily something that was like as opaque in the North, it was still something that he was very aware of. So moving forward, I argue that basically the political ideologies of Garvey and Du Bois essentially clashes in the courtroom itself. Now, why do I say that? Well, here's the thing. Judge Mack was someone who essentially, I would assume, right, just kind of putting the pieces together and thinking about this particular time period, we end up kind of watching this rise in the 1920s essentially, and definitely into the 1930s of anti-Semitism. And I want to say this very plainly. Anti-Semitism is what kind of creates the runway for anti-Blackness, right? Like anti-Semitism has been going on for centuries. Essentially, before white folks ended up coming to the New World to make our lives hard, they were making Jewish people's lives hard first, right? They were perfecting their violence with Jewish bodies and then came over to the New World and essentially kind of expounded on that oppression, particularly white Christian people. And so we end up seeing kind of this scapegoating and nationalism that ends up rising in the 1920s that obviously Judge Mack is also bearing witness to. And if we think about Black nationalism or the nationalism that Garvey was basically attracted to, it was essentially somewhat grounded in this anti-Semitism. And while while we as Black folks or people who read about Garvey, I'm a daughter of like a second generation Rastafarian, I appreciate the strides that Marcus Garvey has made and how important Pan-Africanism is and Pan-Caribbeanism is for myself and for many other Black people. And at the same time, it's important for us to recognize the ways in which Marcus Garvey's nationalism and what Mark Christian Thompson would also argue would be fascism. It's important for us to identify that while we kind of tease out what happened. So, thinking about Garvey a little bit more, he obviously had more than just some flirtations with fascism. So Mark Christian Thompson believes that Garvey's ideologies were essentially grounded in fascism. So in chapter 2 of Thompson's book, Black Fascism, African American Literature and Culture Between the Wars, Garvey is essentially cited as someone who admired Hitler, someone who admired Mussolini, and these men were essentially the strong men of the time. This is what to Garvey looked like power. And unfortunately, Garvey wanted to kind of embody some of that power, especially just being someone who has always been on the opposite end of that particular power dynamic. So Thompson writes, and I want to read this quote. The point in examining Garvey's political style in relation to political ideology is not, as Paul Gilroy puts it, to undermine the extraordinary achievements of the Garveyite movement, nor discount the very real anti-black racism of European fascists. Instead, the goal is to highlight the affinities between Garvey and fascism, right? So what are some of the ways in which kind of this fascism ends up popping up within the movement? And I won't go through like a million, but like Garvey was someone who believed that like colonialism and like modernity were like goals to be like achieved as like black people, which essentially it's like, do we want freedom or do we want to be white people, which are two completely different things? Do we want to dismantle the system for the benefit of us as black people, or do we want to embody whiteness and reinforce the same power dynamics with different faces? And this became extremely clear once Italy ended up invading Ethiopia. And Garvey believed that like, because Ethiopia wasn't as advanced and modern as, Europe, they essentially deserved to be invaded. And of course, this didn't bode well with Haile Selassie, and it's interesting because it's like Garvey says all this stuff and then, expects for Haile Selassie to go ahead and like listen to him speak in London. And of course, Haile Selassie ends up giving him the cold shoulder, like, girl, if you don't get out of my face. So just even in just the ways in which like folks dressed and, like the parades that happen in Harlem, right? Like, while we kind of look at these expressions of, kind of a performance of this, I guess, trying to be fascist without the power of whiteness, we see that essentially, Garvey did have some ideas that would ruffle the feathers of Jewish people who have a bit more of the history and the know-how about why those particular ideologies are violent. And of course, I mean, like, the high side is 2020, but I mean, like, we know that a lot of these nationalist ideas end up leading towards, for example, the Holocaust in Europe. Thompson also cites Rupert Lewis and Paul Gilroy, who don't deny Garvey's fascism in the way that we do as the wider public. Because of this collision of political ideology and power in the courtroom, we can definitely see how Judge Mack would have been influenced through his affiliation as a founding member of the NAACP. And in his personal belief, he believed that, colored people, they definitely needed the friendliness of someone who was fair like him. So I guess for him, he felt like that was his way of saying that he was an ally to black folks. So how could he be, how could Judge Mack be someone who is biased in this case with Marcus Garvey, right? So legal scholar Justin Hansford also alleges that Judge Mack was subscribed to the Crisis magazine, which was a publication of the NAACP, and also a financial contributor to the organization. However, Judge Mack, in his defense, ends up saying that, he, didn't necessarily need to recuse himself because while yes, he was subscribed, he only kind of glanced at the headlines. But of course, like, Marcus Garvey didn't necessarily think that that was a substantive claim because there were already about 5 different articles that were written about this man, and like, how could that not influence how you're thinking about Garvey? Hansford, he also argues that like there was a 19-year-old named Schuler Cargill who basically lied on Garvey's name, lied on the stand, and essentially said that like Garvey mailed a letter to somebody by the name of Benny Dancy, who sent a letter to him basically kind of trying to coerce them into buying shares for the Black Star Line, which was Garvey's shipping company. while it was essentially going under. And then Cargill, this 19-year-old, ends up admitting later on that, like, yeah, actually, you know, prosecutor Maxwell Maluk basically told me that I should lie in court. And during like the cross-examination, couldn't necessarily name who their immediate supervisor was or should have been in that particular case. And so just a lot of the evidence around this particular case was very shady and not necessarily holding up in the light. Other forms of evidence that just essentially just made this case just like, girl, what the hell is going on? So the Black Star Line, so for those of us who, I'm not going to go too in depth in like what the Black Star Line was. It was a shipping company at the time. Like, shipping companies were like making a whole bunch of money until Marcus Garvey decided to enter the market. Now, the Black Star Line consisted of two different ships, the SS Yarmouth and the SS Tennyson. Unfortunately, the purchase of the ships coincided with the downturn of the shipping industry. So the SS Yarmouth was essentially just like a rickety old ship, and like it had eternal problems. There was always something broken and wrong on that particular ship. Repairs constantly had to be made, and unfortunately, when you kind of look at the books, the ship was bought for, you know, around US $165,000. But then once kind of officials went to kind of look at the books to see what this actual ship would cost in real time at the time of this particular case, the ship was worth $25,000. And unfortunately, the captain who was supposed to be facilitating the sale received a kickback of $1,600. And, you know, the unfortunate part about this whole story is the fact that, like, there were so many Black people who, like, had jobs. And, like, it's unfortunate because the idea was there. It was the timing that was off, and Marcus Garvey just not necessarily having the business acumen in order to really like ensure that all his T's were dotted and all his I's were crossed. And the fact that like the people who were, you know, in on his team weren't necessarily looking out for his best interests also ensured that the Black Star Line ended up basically going down. So then we have the SS Tennyson, which was basically set to be purchased in 1921 and was supposed to be renamed after Phyllis Wheatley, the teenage prodigy who ended up being like, you know, an amazing poet and, you know, kind of, you know, was cool with George Washington, so on and so forth. So the ship was set to make a transatlantic trip to West Africa, and of course there was no ship. Orlando Thompson was supposed to be like the facilitator of that particular purchase of the ship, and of course in their like his particular shady dealings, he felt as though he wasn't going to necessarily be able to purchase the ship on his own as a Black person in the 1920s. So he went and kind of asked Anthony Silverstein to go ahead and like engage in like the purchasing situation. And the ship was supposed to be purchased for $20,000. However, only $12,500 was deposited with the shipping board. And of course, Mr. Silverstein ran off with the rest of the money. And at the time when this particular like fleecing of Garvey's money ended up happening, Garvey was not in the country. And then by this time, Garvey was barred from entry by the State Department because the State Department believed that he was kind of inciting, you know, inflammatory kind of race relations in the country and barred him, and he couldn't necessarily re-enter until they granted him permission. And by that time he had to be convicted and was faced with 5 years imprisonment and deported back to Jamaica in 1927. Now, Garvey did not serve all 5 years of his He did not serve all 5 years of his time. President Coolidge decided to commute his time, which essentially led to Marcus Garvey being deported back to Jamaica. And Garvey made it very clear that, like, if he was deported, he wasn't going to put up a fight, and he did not. And I also, before I kind of move forward, like, I want to just name the fact that, like, Marcus Garvey, a lot of times when we tell the story of Marcus Garvey, we end up we pretend as though, or not even pretend, I think it's just because people don't know. Marcus Garvey didn't just keel over and die once he was deported. He ended up becoming a council person in Jamaica, in Kingston particularly. He ended up founding his own political party. And yes, while the political party is not necessarily, like, active at this time, he still was very, very active in engaging, you know, just like Black politics, and ensuring that, like, we move toward decolonization and essentially uplifting, like, Black people globally. Now, while everybody didn't necessarily agree with the how, right, but we can see, like, the passion that was there, and just, like, the good faith, you know, just, like, striving to uplift us as Black people. And the fact that it's 2025 and we still have people advocating for Marcus Garvey just is a testament to just how much work he did at the time, and why, like, it's important to kind of just, like, you know, take stock of how far we've come. So essentially, Marcus Garvey is someone who had a long legacy of supporting Black folks within the diaspora, and changed the way how Black people saw themselves. The thing that upsets me, though, is that we forget just how incredible Marcus Garvey was after his deportation. Marcus Garvey was someone who founded the PPP, the People's Political Party, which was essentially, like, you know, a modern political party that has been, like, was one of a kind, and obviously didn't necessarily have the same backing as, you know, the PMP or the JLP in Jamaica. And here is just a few of the things that Marcus Garvey advocated for in his PPP manifesto. So the first being an 8-hour workday, right? A basic minimum wage, which is still something that a lot of Jamaican people are, like, advocating for and pushing towards, because of course the vast majority of people on the island are still not making a livable wage. And I'll leave the number here. A larger share of self-governance, protection for industries that are, like, indigenous to, you know, just, like, the island, right? Legal aid, right? You know, for people who are poor, right? Technical schools that exist in each parish, land reform, libraries and civic improvement for parish capitals, and city status for the city of Montego Bay and Port Antonio. And lastly, a national park at Kingston Racecourse. And the only other time that the PPP was essentially, like, contested in a major election was in 1962, and did not receive a chunk of, not even a fraction of the vote. But I do think that this moment gives us a time to reflect on just how important Marcus Garvey's legacy is to us, not just as Caribbean people or Jamaican people who understand him to be our first national hero, but also just as someone who had a very colorful legacy, and, like, it's important that as we remember him, we remember the strides that we have made through Marcus Garvey, and also understand some of the ways in which our, you know, our political thought process might have been vulnerable to some of the literal violence of the time. I look forward to returning to this conversation with regards to an exoneration, but a pardon is definitely a symbolic start in the right direction. I'm hoping that as we continue to think about like his pardon, that we also consider the many ways in which we still need to advocate for ourselves in 2025. Like, for example, as we enter in the Donald Trump, as we enter in the era of Donald Trump, that we really take into consideration immigration and what that looks like, and protecting the people who are the most vulnerable in terms of our community, in addition to, like protecting our capital, the capital that we have at this point in time, and what that looks like to ensure that our community, we are depending on each other in order to thrive. So with that being said, I'm a small axe, you're a small axe, and this is a small axe. Thank you so much for joining me, and please check out these videos. Check out these videos.